From Southern California, this is The Circle of Insight, a show about everything in psychology. Hear the latest in news and views on psychology. Our motto is simple: wherever there is psychology involved, we are there. And now, here's your host of The Circle of Insight, Carlos Vasquez.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Carlos Vasquez, doctoral candidate in psychology and the host of The Circle of Insight, where we discuss the topics you have chosen with leading experts. Our motto is simple: wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. Today we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence. What is that? Well, it's a big topic and a very important topic. Believe it or not, 90% of top performers in the workforce have a high, what they call EQ, emotional intelligence. So let's find out more about this with our special guest, Nanci Besser. Nanci Besser is an emotional intelligence specialist, author, speaker, mindfulness teacher, and Pilates instructor. She believes it's a holistic approach to get high emotional intelligence. Thank you very much, Nanci, for coming.
Thank you, Carlos. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So today, what I want to do is start off a little bit about learning about you for the first few minutes and then finding out what emotional intelligence is.
Absolutely. What can I tell you?
How did you get started in this, emotional intelligence?
Well, that's kind of a long story, but I'll
right.
try to give you the two-bar version of it. So basically, I was in my master's program for organizational psychology, and emotional intelligence was sort of the up-and-coming new age thought sort of thing. And at the time, they were saying, oh, it's just qualitative science. There's no quantitative to back it up. And everyone knows about psychology. They really try to have empirical-based studies. And emotional intelligence was still kind of just this thing that people sort of knew about, but there was a lot of mystique about it. And what drew me to it was Paul Ekman's work. And if you don't know about him, he had done quite a bit of research on looking at the universality of microexpressions. And a big part of emotional intelligence also is about nonverbal communication. So it looks at the way that you carry yourself, everything down to your body language, to your tone and your pace of your speech. All these different components go into our ability to be able to regulate and also recognize our own emotions.
You know, you're making me self-conscious right now.
Don't worry, I'm not analyzing you.
Now, Paul Ekman, I think he was one of the proponents for that show, Lie to Me or something?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
He was actually one of the main consultants for the show.
And he mentioned something I always am fascinated about. There were 7 universal expressions? Is that what it was?
Exactly.
I don't know are you familiar with the 7?
So I do believe that they're really the base level of emotions, and it's the anger and the fear, and definitely happiness. And there's a lot of research into the genuine expression of happiness, or basically what's called the Duchenne smile. And the Duchenne smile is able to be distinguished by if you have the presence of both kind of the mouth being engaged in the smile, and then also the crow's feet, little lines that you think about too. And that if those two things are present, then you have a genuine display of expression.
Very fascinating. So we know you got into EQ, organizational psychology kind of drove you that way. What is EQ?
Well, EQ has many different layers to it. And one of kind of the gurus of emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman. And he started to basically bring emotional intelligence into the public's eye through his book, Emotional Intelligence. And I believe it was in 1995 that it was published. And it really brought emotional intelligence into topic of conversation. Even around dinner tables, you started hearing it. And what he said emotional intelligence was defined by were the 3 sort of abilities. One is the ability to be able to be aware of, name, and also to recognize your own emotions. Then the second step is the ability to be able to recognize, name, and understand. So there's a crucial difference between other people's emotions as well. And then the third component that kind of ties everything together is the ability to be able to relate to others in effective ways, based on you being able to understand their emotions as they're being expressed in a wide variety of contexts in both professional and personal settings.
So is there a negative effect to having low EQ?
Oh, yeah, actually.
Does it affect your workplace or anything like that?
Absolutely. There's been a recent study that said that if you have low EQ, you can expect to earn about $29,000 less per year than your high EQ counterparts.
That's a lot.
Yeah,
That's
it
a
really
significant
adds
amount.
up.
Wow. So 29,000, I guess in the statistic I mentioned earlier, 90% of top performers have a high EQ, which I guess means maybe the 10% that don't.
Right.
You don't have top performers.
Exactly.
How does it affect you in a relationship, outside a personal relationship?
Well, in a relationship, if you have a high measure of EQ, you're going to be able to be much more empathic to your partner. And that means that you're going to be able to not only see things through their perspective, but in addition, I like to think of empathy as including the ability to be able to create space for your partner to basically see the world as they are, not the way that you think that they should be seeing. So it takes away a preconceived judgment and it instead empowers your partner to be who they are without you trying to change them.
So do you think right now society, actually I keep bringing this up in some of the shows, you're probably getting tired of hearing it, but a lot of TV shows tend to guide us, especially when we're younger, in the early 20s, late teens, of how to interact with each other. Mm-hmm. And one of my pet peeves is that a lot of times you'll see somebody having an argument, and then they just walk out, and nothing's ever settled.
Right.
A big event happens, and then they're back together again. It takes this, and doesn't seem to be...
Yeah, the sitcom mentality to life,
Yes.
basically.
And I don't want that kind of resolutions in my conflict. So what are some of the negatives that you would see in a relationship? Do you see people having misunderstandings? Is there a lack of communication?
Absolutely. And you definitely get the tendency for one of the partners that has the more low-key, low EQ measure would then be less likely to take accountability for themselves. So they're going to be the kind of partner who says that, well, if only she or he would do X, Y, or Z different, then I would have a different experience. So they pass the buck of accountability.
Pass the buck. Now we talked a little earlier, and you were mentioning some characteristics of low EQ people. Mm-hmm. Can you go over that a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the main things that distinguishes somebody as having low EQ is that they will have that tendency, like I said, about blaming other people and not taking their own accountability. The other big sort of red flag to let you know that someone you're dealing with has low EQ is their inability to receive any sort of critical feedback, because it's either their way or the highway. So they don't really want to hear that anything they're doing is less than perfect.
Do you think that's pretty prevalent? Those two seem really strong. There seems to be a strong connection between those first two.
Yes, I do. I think that there is kind of that correlation between the two of them. And then that sort of sets up also the person to not really be open to hearing anyone else's opinions or feedback. So it gets them in this really kind of isolated sort of bubble mentality of that they don't have any room for anyone else's information.
And is that something you're seeing more prevalent now in the last 20, 30 years? I mean, do you think maybe society's this constant bombardment with stimuli we have from iPads and
Right.
iPods, and then we have from TV shows, and there's just always something to do. And also the TV seems to be gearing where people don't want to receive criticism.
Right, and especially because you have these kind of anti-heroes, archetypes in television. You look at like Dr. House or something like that, for instance,
yes.
in pop culture, right? I mean, he was a very, in some ways, low EQ kind of personality because it was really his way or the highway. And he didn't want to hear anybody else. And yes, he was able to usually resolve the conflicts by his magical interventions, and he was usually right. And so he was positively reinforced to continue that behavior. But
Interesting.
the show also did demonstrate the challenges that he faced interpersonally with his colleagues. And if he hadn't been successful at his actual level of expertise, he may have had a more difficult time.
It's interesting. Well, that kind of makes me want to think, so where do we get this low EQ? Is it a lack?
Well, some people believe that it's sort of the nature versus nurture, basically debate that most of psychology wrestles with in many different contexts. But EQ is definitely among the same types of topics that people want to know. Is it something you're born with? Or is it something that you adapt or that you receive by being exposed to? And can it be controlled or can it be managed? And are there ways to add more EQ into your life?
And what do you think? Do you think it's a combination of nature and nurture?
I do. I think that to say it's one or the other would be too extremist. That I've seen people that basically they have had very low measures of EQ in many different types of assessments, and they have had some positive changes by being able to look at themselves. But it comes down to the person's willingness to change. And that's something that you can't teach somebody. They really have to kind of get their own ego out of the way and decide that what they've done to this point hasn't given them the effective results that they want. And they're willing to do the work to make it be different.
That's true. That's a very hard thing to do. A lot of people have a challenge with that, and we're going to talk more about that in part 2 when we find out how Nancy's going to help people get high EQ. But before we go to that, we're going to continue talking a little bit more. Now, the workplace is something you deal with a lot, it seems like.
Absolutely.
Work with a lot of people there. What are some of the conflicts or issues that come up with low EQ?
Well, typically you'll see a disagreement about how to approach a problem, for one example. So that maybe there'll be a project that a work team is assigned to, and somebody with high EQ is going to be able to acknowledge other people's ideas and opinions, as well as to voice what's important to him or her without taking it personally if everyone doesn't buy into it. Somebody with low EQ may have the opposite effect, where all of a sudden they're feeling personally attacked if everyone isn't, basically flying their banner and coming behind them.
That could be a big problem for work.
Entirely big.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Now you also mentioned that sometimes people with low EQ tend to be passive, sometimes aggressive.
Yes, and then they can also be the combination of passive-aggressive and a style of communication, which can be very difficult because basically then you never really know where you stand with a person, because maybe they'll be smiling on the outside and be planning your demise underneath. and that's kind of where the reading the emotions of the micro-expressions comes into play too, that there are certain micro-expressions that we have no control over, but that do flash. And people that are trained in deception analysis or different sort of things like Ekman had studied, they can actually recognize and key into that. And it doesn't just take an expert. You can actually become much more versed by reading either online manuals or attending different classes. There's a bunch of different things. For instance, like this is a form of disgust. And if you see that expression with somebody,
Did you guys see that? What was that again?
If they're, like that, if they're talking about something and they're saying with a smile on their face, but they flash disgust, you can guess that there's more to what they're saying. You can't say exactly what they're not telling you the truth about, but you know there's something that's not basically having dissonance, it's having cognitive dissonance.
So now you're saying that the person with a low EQ will express that? Or
They
not
may
pick it up
or
as
may
much?
not. So they can either express it and be unaware of the fact that they are belying their emotions, basically, or they can miss nonverbal cues from their colleagues that may or may not be conveying those to them.
So if somebody said something to them, you want to go here to lunch, and they go like this and
Right.
they miss it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And
Very
they're very, very, very subtle things. And I mean, there's tons of research and training for people to become experts in this. But there are just simple guides people can look at for how to become more emotionally intelligent using microexpressions.
Interesting. We'll talk more about microexpressions and how to use those. Hopefully in part 2 we'll find out more about that. So what else do they have? I mean, is there anything else that we can recognize from low EQ individuals?
Well, low EQs individuals are going to be your big time leaders who don't listen. You can basically identify them as maybe that C-level executive who somehow has risen to power because just that, it's kind of like the House story, that they had enough of their expertise and their skills, but they don't have the interpersonal skills. And so you're going to see these leaders as being the ones who get up and say their platform is all that matters, that they ignore anybody else that's following them, and they end up basically alienating themselves from anybody who really could be their greatest proponent.
So a low EQ leader with a low EQ employee staff, we have a big problem.
Absolutely. Then you better
Yeah.
do some serious restaffing.
Sounds like it. Sounds like it can cause a lot of issues with the low EQ.
Absolutely. And that's why companies are beginning to invest money and hours and training also into working with individuals and teams to increase emotional intelligence.
Now, is there anything that you've noticed, any patterns? I'm assuming you're working with individuals as well as companies. Have you noticed any patterns in upbringing?
What I would say is that if they were raised by narcissistic parents, that they tend to have a less likelihood to be able to understand empathy, because the parent themselves then doesn't display the empathy to the child. And so basically, a lot of times as children, we are taught to model what it is that's being reflected to us. And we either tend to continue that same type of situation, or we go the exact opposite. So what I've seen in people is that if they did have upbringings by kind of narcissistic, or at least one narcissistic parent, where empathy was not really modeled back and forth to the child, then either you're going to see an extremely low EQ person or an extremely high EQ person. It sort of goes to either side.
Is there a problem being a high EQ person?
There's not really a problem with it. There has been some research into, is too much empathy a bad thing? Basically, is it going to be a problem by carrying people's emotions as your own? And so there is an importance to be able to give people the space to have their own way of processing and handling things, but to be able to understand what they're going through, but not feel like you have the weight of the world on your shoulders where you have to solve it for them.
That's interesting. That makes me think a little bit. So the high EQ possibly could have an issue. Low EQ, we know, has a lot of issues. We've seen it at the workplace. We've seen it possibly maybe with the parents.
Right.
Narcissistic tendencies, maybe. There's possible correlations there.
Right, observation.
Yeah, we don't want to accuse anybody of anything. And do you see it anywhere else, in anything else that may lead to the low EQ?
What I've seen with people is that if they tend to have kind of an isolating type of personality, so if they're more of kind of a lone wolf, and maybe somebody who literally classifies themselves as a loner or more of an introvert, but not all introverts and not all extroverts. So there doesn't seem to be a distinguishing characteristic between having low EQ versus high EQ if you're introverted or extroverted, because I've seen both. But there is a tendency that if you've grown up kind of being a loner, where you've been able to do things on your own, completely autonomous, that you're going to be much less likely to be able to join into a team setting and feel comfortable.
So before we just label people low and high EQ, there must be a scale of rating.
There is. So there's a couple different measures of assessment, and they've got them for being able to recognize those microexpressions that I talked about. That's one sort of assessment. There's also the DISC model of assessment, looking at different abilities across different parameters. And then there's many, many others that have come about that are now trying to say that there is a quantitative way to measure empathy, which up until this point, pretty recently, was sort of just qualitative fluff in a lot of researchers' eyes.
That's interesting. So please, if you're introverted or don't like a lot of social contact, it does not mean you have a low EQ.
Right.
See a specialist, Nancy, or whoever you may be local to you, to figure out what your EQ measurement is. And that's something I wanted to talk about too, is empathy. Empathy is a big thing.
Yes.
I know you wrote a brilliant article, you can get it on LinkedIn, about empathy. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I know you explained what empathy is, but how does it work in the workplace? And we know I kind of get the idea of the relationships.
Sure.
Understanding your significant other. And, well, before I get to that point, I was thinking about something, but let's go back to the workplace on empathy.
Okay.
How does it work there?
So empathy in the workplace is very important, because especially from a leadership perspective. So if you get a manager who has a high degree of an empathic sense of reasoning and understanding, then he or she is going to be much more likely to empower their team to succeed, because they're going to know who they are and not need the external validation from somebody else. So that allows them to be able to have their best interest at heart for their teammates, so that it's not basically about the ego of the manager, it's about what's best for the team.
Oh, that's amazing. That sounds like an ideal manager for me.
It would be ideal.
So on the relationship level, I know a lot of times we try to put ourselves, we should put ourselves in another person's, in our significant other's shoes.
Yes. Or literally see through their eyes.
Literally see through their eyes.
Yes.
There's sometimes, now let's say my significant other is there and I'm trying to see how she's viewing this particular event. Does our perception, you gotta stick with me here, it's going to be complicated, I don't know if I can express it. If our perception affects how we think they're seeing through their eyes. In other words, if I'm afraid of something or I have anxiety about a certain particular thing or some kind of emotional attachment to an event, and I'm thinking, well, how is she viewing this over here?
Right. And you're seeing it through your own filter.
I think I'm seeing it through hers, but I'm still filtering it through mine. Does that happen?
And that's definitely a good point, is that we can tend to bring our preconceived judgments and especially our fears into our, quote, empathy, which isn't really then true empathy, because
how much easier she said that.
It's making it about us instead of the other person. So it's sort of flying in the face of the definition of empathy. But at the same time, we have to be gentle with ourselves. We can't be harsh and judge ourselves for trying to not judge another person because that sort of defeats the whole purpose, and it creates this vicious cycle of guilt, which you definitely don't want to get into, because then you're going to be much less likely to actually experience real empathy because you're going to be so overwhelmed by the guilt yourself.
Interesting. And do you have any kind of inclination of why you think people nowadays, it seems, I'm going to use generalizations here, why people tend to be defensive in regards to criticism? Right now you can't say anything. Everybody is a winner.
Right.
We've heard that philosophy right now. Everybody wins no matter how badly
Everyone's
you lost.
special, so no one's special.
Yeah.
I think a big part of it is that we kind of basically overcorrected. So, there was so much between the classes and the haves and the have-nots and everything, and we kind of overcorrected, and we went back to this idea rather than balance. We went into this thing of that, well, we got to make sure everyone's okay and that everyone feels validated and everyone feels, and in a perfect world, that might be a good thing. But unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where good things happen to bad people and, quote, good things happen to good people. So you have to kind of be able to balance that out a little bit. And what I think has happened is that we have begun to make struggling or having challenges as a thing that you want to avoid versus something that actually can help you to transcend through your life. So if the goal is to not resist things in life or to cling to them, but just to basically learn how to pass through them, but not deny them, then I think that that's a big part of being able to look at who you really are. And if you're going to take in criticism as basically having to put your defense up, then that means that you must have felt you were attacked. Because nobody's going to defend something unless they feel like they were attacked in the first place. And so I think that's part of the fundamental sort of misconception that's happened, is that we've all sort of believed that, well, if everyone isn't flying my banner and, touting my song or something, then they must be completely against me. There's no gradation anymore.
It's either or.
Right. All or nothing.
And we'll learn more from Nanci on how we can improve that, how we can overcome that, how we can accept criticism, how we can give it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nanci, for joining us. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
It's a lot of information. She knows it like that. Perfect. And thank you for joining us as well on the Circle of Insight. If you want more information about the Circle, you can go to facebook.com/Circle of Insight, where you can see daily updates, make comments about today's show or past shows, and you can also look at future shows, such as coming up next, part 2 of EQ, Emotional Intelligence, and how we can improve it to get a higher EQ. You can also find these shows now on iTunes, so you can download the podcast and listen to us in your car. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you next time.